John gritted his teeth, trying to keep himself from slacking. The bull had become too strong, too aggressive. He was wild and unpredictable, his eyes blazing like fire, his every move like a lightning strike. Seconds stretched like hours. John knew that if the bull didn't calm down, this could be the end. He had to find a way to win this fight, but the more he tried to quiet him, the more destructive the animal's anger became. Chapter 1. An unpredictable guest. John and Emma had been preparing for winter for weeks. The days were getting shorter, and the crisp autumn air carried a chill that reminded them of the long, hard months ahead. Their small farm, nestled in the quiet countryside, was their sanctuary, but it also demanded constant attention, especially as the cold set in. Every fall, John and Emma followed the same routine: chopping wood for the stove, fixing fences, and gathering as much food as they could for the winter months. They had a lot of animals to care for: pigs, ducks, geese, rabbits, and 2 cows, and each required attention. The couple had spent the morning sweeping out the barn, making sure the animals had enough fresh bedding. Emma was in the kitchen, preparing a stew, the scent of onions and herbs filling the house. John was outside, fixing a broken gate to the rabbit hutch, when the sound of a car engine broke the stillness of the afternoon. It was an unusual sound. Most people didn't come out this way unless they had business with John. As he squinted down the long, dusty road, a truck appeared in the distance. It was pulling a large livestock trailer, and John's heart skipped a beat. He knew what this meant. He'd been expecting it, but now that it was actually happening, he wasn't sure if he was ready. Emma stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. "Who's that?" she asked. "That's the neighbor, Ben," John said, looking over his shoulder. "He's bringing the bull." Emma's face fell slightly, though she tried to mask her concern. "The bull?" she asked softly. "Yes," John nodded. "The one we've been talking about. We need him for the cows." The bull was a crucial addition to their small herd. John and Emma had been talking about expanding their farm, and the only way to do that was to breed their 2 cows. They had carefully selected the bull from Ben's farm, a strong, healthy animal that could help them grow their herd and secure their future. But now that the moment had arrived, both of them felt a deep, unspoken anxiety. Neither of them had ever worked with a bull before. As the truck came to a stop, Ben climbed out of the cab, his boots crunching on the gravel. He waved at John, who waved back. "You ready for this?" Ben called out with a grin, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice as well. "As ready as we'll ever be," John replied, his voice steady, but his hands betraying a small tremble. The bull stepped out of the trailer, a massive creature with dark brown fur and horns that gleamed in the fading sunlight. His eyes were wild and uncertain, and Emma instinctively took a step back. There was something unnerving about the way he moved, like he was already sizing up his surroundings, already deciding how to take control of his new home. Ben led the bull toward the pen where the cows were waiting. John and Emma watched in silence, their hearts beating a little faster. They had heard stories of bulls being difficult to handle, unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous. This wasn't something they'd taken lightly. "We'll need to keep a close eye on him," Ben said, glancing over his shoulder. "Bulls can be temperamental, especially when they're in a new place. You'll want to make sure he doesn't get too agitated." John nodded, though Emma couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in her stomach. She had always felt a deep connection with the cows, and the thought of bringing in a bull who could upset their peaceful routine made her uneasy. As Ben left, John and Emma stood in the barn, watching the bull with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The cows were cautiously approaching, and the bull seemed to notice them. He snorted, pawing at the ground, clearly not interested in being peaceful. Emma stepped forward, her hand on her hip, watching closely. "He's going to need a lot of space," John murmured. "How do we keep him from getting too upset?" Emma asked, her voice tight with worry. "We'll need to get him used to the surroundings first," John said, "and be patient. It's going to take some time." The bull's first few hours on the farm passed without incident, but the tension in the air was palpable. John and Emma watched the animals closely, trying to figure out how to introduce them without too much stress. The bull had his own pen, separate from the cows, but every time they walked past, the bull would let out a loud, menacing bellow, making Emma jump. That night, they went to bed exhausted but satisfied with what they had managed to accomplish. The house was warm, and the stew had been delicious, though Emma's mind was still on the bull. She lay in bed, listening to the faint sounds of the animals outside, trying to convince herself that everything would be fine. But in the middle of the night, everything changed. The sound of hooves pounding against the ground woke them both from their sleep. It was a thunderous noise, unlike anything they had ever heard before. John shot up, his heart racing. "Emma," he gasped, throwing off the covers. "The bull!" Emma was already out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor as she rushed to the window. Her breath fogged up the glass as she looked out into the night. The barn loomed in the distance, the lights from the house casting long shadows across the yard. "John, he's out," Emma cried, her voice filled with panic. "He's out of the pen." John didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket and dashed outside, Emma close behind. The bull was rampaging through the yard, his massive body crashing into fences, knocking over posts, and scattering the other animals. The cows were nowhere to be seen, terrified and hiding in the corners of the barn. The ducks and geese flapped wildly in the yard, squawking in panic. "John, we need to stop him," Emma shouted, but her voice was barely audible over the chaos. John's mind raced as he ran toward the bull, but the animal was in a frenzy, thrashing around and charging at anything in its path. The barn doors had been smashed open, and the bull was charging through, tearing apart the wooden walls with every blow. "Get back, Emma!" John shouted, pulling her behind him as the bull turned, eyes wild with fear and rage. He had never seen an animal so out of control, and in that moment, John realized just how dangerous a bull could be. He had no idea how to stop it, no idea how to calm the animal down. His heart was pounding in his chest as he considered the wreckage the bull was leaving in its wake. The barn was collapsing around them, and the once peaceful farm was now a scene of utter destruction. As the bull continued its rampage, John knew one thing for certain. They needed to stop him before everything they had worked for was lost. Chapter 2: Wounded Feelings. The chaos of the previous night lingered in the air as Emma and John stood amidst the wreckage of the barn. The bull's rampage had left a trail of destruction that neither of them could have ever anticipated. Emma's hands trembled as she clutched her coat tighter around her body, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The dark outlines of the barn loomed like a jagged scar against the early morning sky. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung heavy over her, a feeling that something precious, something irreplaceable, had been taken from them. "Are the cows okay?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant cries of the animals still scattered across the yard. John, still catching his breath from the frantic dash to stop the bull, glanced around, his gaze frantic. The cows were huddled in the farthest corner of the barn, their eyes wide with fear. The barn itself, once sturdy and secure, was now a crumpled mess of splintered wood and broken fencing. The bull, meanwhile, had vanished into the distant fields, his rage still palpable in the air. He had finally been exhausted enough by his wild behavior to retreat, but the damage was done. "They're all right," John said, his voice hoarse. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, eyes dark with worry. "But the barn's a wreck, and we can't leave him out there too long. He's too dangerous." Emma nodded, her heart heavy. She was trying to keep it together, but the sight of the animals in distress, the barn reduced to rubble, and the uncertainty of what would happen next made her feel helpless. Her hands ached to do something, anything, but she couldn't stop thinking about how they had ended up in this situation. They had only wanted to expand, to bring more life to the farm, but instead, they were facing a disaster that felt beyond their control. "We need to calm him down," John muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "But I don't know how. I've never dealt with anything like this before." Emma walked over to the broken gate where the bull had torn through, her heart racing as she surveyed the damage. It was almost as if the bull had been possessed by something otherworldly. He had been so wild, so out of control, and now he was out there, somewhere in the vast fields, and they had no way of knowing what he might do next. "John, we have to do something," Emma said, her voice breaking as she turned to face him. "What if he hurts someone? What if he goes after the other animals again?" John's brow furrowed as he looked toward the fields. "I know," he said quietly. "I know." The reality of the situation hit Emma with the force of a wave, crashing over her. She felt her stomach twist in anxiety. They couldn't just sit back and let it all spiral out of control. They had to fix this. But how? "We can't leave him out there like that," Emma said again, more urgently this time. "We need to get him back into the pen. He's too dangerous to be wandering around." John nodded, his expression grim. "I'll try to get him. If we can't control him, we might need to. Well, we might have to put him down." Emma's heart lurched at the thought. She had never been one to shy away from the hard decisions of farm life. But this was different. She had seen the bull only yesterday, full of life, an eager participant in their plans for the future. To think that they might have to end it all so quickly made her chest tighten with a mix of grief and anger. She wasn't ready to give up yet, not when they had only just begun. "We'll find another way," she said, more to herself than to John. "We have to." But the moments dragged on, and the weight of their decision hung heavily between them. John picked up a pitchfork and slowly made his way toward the barn door, peering into the darkness. "Stay back, Emma. If he charges again, I won't be able to stop him." Emma wanted to protest, to insist that she should be the one to go, but she could see the pain in his eyes. He was already carrying the burden of their failing farm on his shoulders. He didn't need her second-guessing him now. She stayed where she was, watching helplessly. The next hour was a blur of anxiety. John managed to coax the cows back into their stall, checking them over carefully for any injuries, though they seemed to be fine for now. Still, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that things were slipping through her fingers. Everything was out of their control. It was like they were back at square one, only worse. The farm, the animals, everything they had worked for, felt fragile in that moment. Emma was pacing back and forth, her thoughts spiraling, when she heard the sound of a truck engine approaching once again. She looked up, squinting against the glare of the midday sun. It was Ben's truck, his familiar red truck pulling into the yard, just as it had the day before when he had brought the bull. John turned at the sound too, relief flooding his face when he saw Ben's truck. "Thank God," he muttered. Ben hopped out of the truck, his usual calm demeanor now mixed with an urgency that mirrored the anxiety in the air. "I heard about the bull," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of concern. "Saw the damage from the road. Figured I'd come help." "You're a godsend," John said, his voice laced with gratitude. "We don't know what to do. He's completely out of control, and I don't know how to calm him down." Ben nodded, sizing up the situation. He had dealt with plenty of difficult animals in his time, but he knew this was no small feat. "All right, let's get this sorted," he said with determination. "I'll help you get him back in the pen. But you have to stay calm, both of you." He can sense fear. Emma, despite the knot in her stomach, couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Ben was experienced. He had handled bulls before. If anyone could help them, it was him. "All right, let's do it," John said, the weight of the situation still heavy on his shoulders but with a new resolve. "Lead the way." Ben wasted no time. He led them to the truck where he had brought some additional equipment, ropes, calming agents, and a sturdy lead. They had no choice but to move quickly. The bull wasn't getting any calmer on his own, and they couldn't afford to wait any longer. With Ben's calm instructions, they worked together, drawing closer to the bull's last known location. Every step felt like a gamble. Would the bull remain docile enough for them to approach, or would he charge again? Emma's heart raced, but she focused on Ben's voice, steady and clear, guiding her and John as they closed in on the bull. She held her breath, waiting for the next unpredictable move. Chapter 3: Troubling Nights. The day had finally wound down, and John and Emma, exhausted from the events of the past 24 hours, were hoping for a peaceful night. The barn was partially repaired, the animals were calmed, and the cows had been returned to their pen without further incident. Even the bull, though still unsettled, seemed to have quieted somewhat. John and Emma had fed everyone, checked on all the animals, and locked up the barn for the night, eager for some semblance of normalcy to return. They sat in their cozy living room, the warmth of the fire flickering in the hearth as the wind began to pick up outside. Emma sipped her tea, her eyes heavy with fatigue, while John flipped through an old farming magazine, occasionally looking up to make sure the fire was still going strong. For a brief moment, everything seemed serene. "We could use a bit of rest," Emma murmured, leaning back in her chair and closing her eyes. "Maybe tomorrow will be a better day." John nodded, but his mind lingered on the bull. He couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. They had managed to contain him for now, but John knew how volatile bulls could be. He couldn't stop thinking about the damage the bull had caused the night before, and he feared it could happen again. Just as Emma began to drift off to sleep, the first drop of rain tapped against the window, followed by the sudden howl of wind. "Here it comes," John muttered under his breath, glancing out the window. Dark clouds had rolled in quickly, and the storm was about to hit. It was the kind of storm that made the air feel thick and heavy, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Emma stirred, suddenly wide awake. "I'll check on the animals before it gets worse," she said, pushing herself out of the chair. John followed her to the door. "I'll go with you. It might get bad out there." The wind had picked up in force, howling through the trees and whipping the rain sideways. The storm was growing stronger, and as they walked out toward the barn, the sound of thunder rattled the air. They made their way across the yard, stepping cautiously over the wet ground, both of them knowing how unpredictable the night could be. When they reached the barn, Emma went to check on the cows, while John made his way toward the pen where the bull had been kept. The barn was creaking in the wind, and the heavy rain pounded against the roof, drowning out most of the other sounds around them. But then, as John reached the bull's pen, he heard something that made his blood run cold: the sound of frantic thrashing. The bull was in a frenzy again. "Emma!" John shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "Get over here. Now!" Emma quickly joined him, her face pale with worry. She could hear the bull too now, the sound of hooves pounding against wood, the scraping and bellowing that indicated something was horribly wrong. "I thought we calmed him down," she exclaimed, eyes wide with fear. John pushed open the door to the pen, his heart racing as he saw the bull thrashing violently against the sides of his enclosure. The storm was making everything worse. The wind and rain only seemed to fuel the bull's already fragile state of mind. He was stomping and snorting, his eyes wild, his massive body colliding with the sides of the pen. "This isn't good," John said, his voice tight. "We need to get him under control before he tears everything apart." "We can't just leave him like this," Emma said, stepping forward, her gaze fixed on the bull. "He's not going to calm down if we just stand here." Ben's words echoed in John's mind. "You need to be calm." He can sense fear, but right now the only thing John could feel was panic. The bull was so unpredictable, and the storm had only added to his distress. Without thinking, John grabbed a rope from the nearby shed, hoping to tether the bull long enough to calm him. He was about to step forward when the bull, suddenly enraged, charged directly toward him. "John!" Emma screamed, her voice filled with terror. In a flash, the bull was upon them. John barely had time to react before the animal rammed into the gate with terrifying force. Emma jumped back in shock, but John managed to keep his footing. The bull was out of control now. He wasn't just panicking anymore. He was lashing out in pure fury. "We need to stop him before he escapes the pen," John shouted, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Emma grabbed a bucket and began to make noise, hoping to distract the bull. John carefully moved toward him with the rope, but the bull was not having it. He tossed his head and snorted, charging again in a fit of rage. John barely avoided being trampled as he stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to get him down. He's too dangerous," he yelled. The barn had become a battleground. In the heavy rain, John and Emma fought to control the bull, each move calculated and filled with fear. They had no choice but to try and subdue him. If the bull went on like this, it would only be a matter of time before he destroyed everything in his path. Then, as if to add to the intensity of the moment, Ben's truck roared into the yard. "Hold on!" Ben's voice boomed over the storm, and within moments, he was by their side, armed with a tranquilizer gun. "You two step back," Ben instructed, his voice calm and collected despite the chaos around him. John and Emma instinctively obeyed, retreating just out of range. Ben steadied the tranquilizer gun in his hands, aiming carefully at the bull, who was still thrashing around. The shot rang out, a sharp, clear sound that cut through the noise of the storm. The bull paused for a moment, and then, with a low bellow, he stumbled and collapsed to the ground. John and Emma stood frozen, their hearts racing, as the bull's heavy body hit the dirt with a soft thud. "Is he?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. Ben moved forward, checking the bull's pulse. After a tense moment, he nodded. "He's fine. He's just sedated for now, but we'll need to keep an eye on him. This isn't over." John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, and Emma stepped forward, placing a shaky hand on her husband's arm. The bull lay still in the pen, the storm still howling around them, but a calm had finally settled. They had managed to subdue him before things escalated further, but the storm wasn't over, and neither was the uncertainty. As they watched the bull, Emma's mind raced with questions. What had caused the bull to behave like this? How could they manage him in the future? The terror they had felt was still fresh, but the bigger question remained. How would they handle the bull once he was fully awake? The night was eerily quiet now, but the questions still hung in the air, unanswered. The storm raged on outside, but inside the barn, all they could do was wait. Chapter 4: The Fire in the Field. The morning light poured through the kitchen window, casting soft golden rays across the wooden table where Emma and John sat, sipping their tea. The calm after the storm was almost a relief, a brief pause from the chaos of the past few days. The animals were fed, the barn secured, and the wind had died down. Emma had even managed to dry some of the wet blankets and towels they had used during the storm, folding them neatly in the corner of the kitchen. Everything felt still, quiet, as though the world had taken a breath and was allowing them a moment of peace. But that stillness didn't last long. John was the first to notice the change. He sat by the window, the morning sun reflecting off the field of corn outside, when his brow furrowed. The air had taken on an unusual heaviness, the faint scent of something strange mixing with the crispness of the earth. He stood up quickly and walked over to the door, opening it just enough to get a better look. "Emma," he called, his voice laced with concern. "Come here." Emma walked over, her hand brushing the edge of the table as she joined him at the door. She stood silently for a moment, her eyes scanning the horizon. At first, it seemed like nothing was out of the ordinary. The cornfield, still lush and green, stretched before them in peaceful rows. But then she smelled it, the unmistakable scent of smoke. Her heart dropped. "Is that smoke?" she asked, a tremor in her voice. John nodded, his face pale. "It is, and it's coming from the field." Without another word, they rushed outside, hearts pounding in their chests. The wind had shifted overnight, carrying the smell of smoke with it, but now it was more than just a smell. A thick, gray haze was rising from the edge of the cornfield, where flames licked the base of the plants, spreading quickly in the dry air. Emma's stomach twisted in fear. She could already see the way the fire was moving, fast, fierce, unstoppable. The dry corn acted as kindling, and the flames seemed to leap higher with every gust of wind. "We have to get to the animals," Emma shouted, her voice frantic. "We need to move them to safety." John didn't hesitate. He grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her towards the barn where they had kept the cows, the goats, and the chickens. The animals were the priority now. There was no time to waste. The wind was rising again, feeding the flames, and the fire was quickly growing beyond what they had feared. The horizon was now thick with smoke, and the crackling sound of burning corn filled the air like an ominous warning. They could see the fire spread in vast arcs, crackling and roaring, as it engulfed the field and made its way toward the edges of the farm. John and Emma raced to the barn, their legs aching with each hurried step, but they didn't slow down. Their minds were focused only on the animals, ensuring they were safe before it was too late. By the time they reached the barn, the fire had already begun to encroach on the edges of the property. The wind was pushing the flames toward them, and there was no telling how quickly it would all burn. The thought of losing everything they had worked for, the animals, their home, the crops they had tended for months, felt unbearable. John reached the barn door and swung it open, shouting to the animals. The cows were calm enough, standing quietly in the corner, but the noise of the fire in the distance had started to make them restless. Emma rushed to them, talking in soothing tones, trying to keep them calm while John opened the gate. Come on, John urged, guiding the cows toward the far end of the barn, away from the growing threat of the fire. He could hear the crackling of the flames, the wind pushing it closer, and his pulse raced. They had to get them out of here. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the direction of the cornfield, followed by a whoosh of hot air as the fire surged forward. John turned, his heart leaping into his throat. The wind was carrying the flames toward them faster than he had anticipated. Emma, we need to move them now, John shouted, panic rising in his chest. Get them to the far pasture. We don't have much time. Emma nodded, her face drawn with fear, and began leading the cows toward the gate. The horses, the chickens, everything had to be moved, and quickly. Every second counted. As they moved the cows into the far pasture, John turned to survey the fire's progress. It was now threatening to consume the entire field in front of them, the wind shifting dangerously. The fire wasn't just in the cornfield anymore. It was spreading fast toward the forest beyond. We need to get the pigs, Emma cried out, fear in her voice. The pigs were still in the pen at the other end of the farm, and they weren't easy to move quickly. John didn't hesitate. He ran toward the pig pen, and Emma followed as quickly as she could, both of them knowing they were running out of time. The wind gusted again, and the fire seemed to roar louder as it spread across the field. The orange glow of the flames was now visible behind them, lighting up the sky like a burning horizon. At the pig pen, they grabbed the handful of pigs and rushed them toward the nearby creek, the only place on the farm that wasn't at risk. The fire had nearly reached the other edge of the property, and the animals were in a panic. The pigs squealed, the chickens fluttered in a frenzy, and the cows mooed nervously. The chaos around them was overwhelming, but they had to stay focused. Come on, just a little farther, John urging the last of the pigs toward the creek. They had done it. They had managed to get the animals to safety, but the fire was far from contained. As John and Emma watched, their hearts sinking, the flames continued to spread, tearing through the cornfield and swallowing everything in its path. The field, their crops, the heart of their livelihood was going up in smoke. The fire raged on, hotter and faster, as they stood helpless, the crackling of the flames filling their ears. They watched as their field burned to the ground, feeling the weight of the loss settling heavily on their hearts. Once the animals were safe, they had no choice but to watch as the fire consumed everything they had worked for. The smell of smoke was thick in the air, and the roar of the flames made it impossible to hear anything else. When the fire finally subsided hours later, leaving only ash and charred remnants behind, Emma and John stood together on the hill, staring out at the devastation. The field was gone, almost entirely burned to the ground. The fire had taken everything from them, but at least they thought they had saved the animals. Chapter 5: Fragile Hopes. The morning after the fire was silent. The usual sounds of the farm, chirping birds, the rustling of the wind through the trees, the gentle moo of the cows, had all been replaced by a heavy, unsettling quiet. The fields that once thrived with tall stalks of corn were now reduced to blackened, smoking remnants. The fire had left behind more than just ash. It had taken with it a sense of stability, a sense of hope for the coming months. John and Emma stood side by side on the hill overlooking the devastation, their faces drawn with exhaustion. The sun was rising, but the warmth it provided seemed hollow, as if the earth itself was mourning the loss of what had been so carefully cultivated. "We'll rebuild," John said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. We have to. Emma nodded, but the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. They had always known farming came with risks, but they had never imagined something like this. The fire had burned through their entire cornfield, an essential part of their harvest and the primary feed for their animals. Without the corn, they would struggle to keep the animals fed through the winter. What are we going to do, John? Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. The pigs, the cows, the chickens. They need more food than we have. John turned to face her, the lines of worry etched deep into his face. We'll find a way, he said again, though he wasn't sure how. We'll have to buy feed from the store, maybe borrow some. It's going to be tight, but we can manage. The truth was, he wasn't sure how they would manage. Their savings had already been stretched thin from the repairs to the barn and the unexpected costs of caring for the animals. The fire had set them back further than he cared to think about. Every step forward had been met with another setback, and now they were facing a season of hunger, not just for themselves, but for the animals they had promised to care for. Emma stood silently, her mind racing with possibilities, but none of them seemed to offer any real hope. They had to think of something, fast. They couldn't afford to wait too long before the winter cold set in, and without the corn, they would need to find alternative sources of feed before the animals went hungry. But just as Emma was about to speak again, the sound of a truck engine approached. She turned toward the road, squinting against the sunlight. A familiar figure came into view. Ben, their neighbor, driving his truck toward them. John and Emma exchanged glances, unsure of what to expect. They had heard nothing from their neighbors in the wake of the fire. Everyone had their own battles to fight, their own concerns, and it seemed like their farm's misfortune had gone unnoticed in the face of the storm and fire that had affected everyone. Ben pulled up beside them and stepped out of the truck, his face etched with concern. I saw the smoke from my house, Ben said, nodding toward the scorched fields. I figured I'd come over and see if there was anything I could do. Emma managed a small, grateful smile, though it was tinged with exhaustion. You've already done more than enough by checking in on us, Ben, she said. We don't know what to do. The fire took everything. The corn was our feed for the winter, and now it's all gone. Ben looked thoughtful for a moment, his hand resting on the hood of his truck as he surveyed the damage. Well, he said after a pause, I don't have much, but I've got some extra feed that I can spare. It's not enough to last the whole winter, but it'll get you through the next few months. John's face softened with relief, but Emma's heart sank. How can we ever repay you? She asked, her voice filled with both gratitude and guilt. They had always tried to stand on their own 2 feet, but now they were relying on the kindness of others to survive. Ben waved off her concern. Don't worry about it, he said with a smile. I've been in your shoes more than once. We all help each other out when we can. You've helped me before, and now it's my turn to return the favor. Emma blinked back tears. It wasn't just the feed that Ben was offering. It was the kindness, the reminder that even in the most difficult times, they weren't alone. But the relief was bittersweet. It wasn't a permanent solution, and they knew it. The animals would still need more, and the cornfield would still be gone. They still had a long road ahead. Thank you, Ben, John said, shaking his neighbor's hand firmly. This means more than you know. Ben gave a small, reassuring smile. It's the least I could do, and if you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask. We're in this together. As Ben drove off, leaving behind the bags of feed, Emma and John stood in silence for a few moments. The feeling of relief was temporary, but it was real. For a brief moment, they allowed themselves to hope again. They had a lifeline, however fragile, to carry them through. Maybe we can get through this, Emma said softly, her eyes lingering on the horizon where the fields used to be. One step at a time, John wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. We will, he said with a quiet determination. It's going to take time, and it's going to be hard, but we're still standing. We still have each other. They stood there for a long moment, taking comfort in the shared silence. The road ahead was uncertain, and the weight of their struggles still loomed large. But for the first time since the fire, they allowed themselves to believe that they might just be able to rebuild. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there would be more hardships to come. She just didn't know yet what those would be or how much they would have to sacrifice along the way. Chapter 6: Rebuilding and Doubts. The days following the fire felt like a blur. Emma and John had barely finished picking up the charred remnants of their lives before the next wave of challenges began to surface. The world outside had shifted from one of warmth and life to something colder, more uncertain, as if the land itself had been scarred by the fire and was now struggling to heal. They had no choice but to keep moving forward, though. The farm wouldn't wait for them to catch their breath. The animals, especially the cows and pigs, still needed care. The garden, though nearly destroyed, might still offer something, if only they could find the strength to plant again. But everything felt different now, less certain. The simple, comforting rhythm of their days had been broken, and they were left trying to rebuild not just their farm, but their spirits. Emma found herself spending most of her time with the cows. The fire had devastated the cornfield, which meant they had to buy expensive feed to keep the cows and pigs fed. She carefully measured out their portions, watching the animals eat with a mix of satisfaction and guilt. The routines they once followed, checking the barn, giving the cows a good brushing, making sure the water troughs were full, had been altered. The cows still seemed calm, but Emma could see that they, too, felt the change. They didn't know it, of course, but they were living through a new reality, and Emma had to adapt to that for their sake. Her mornings were spent tending to the cows, making sure each one had enough to eat, giving them fresh water. She talked to them softly, though they didn't respond the way they used to. It was as though the fire had changed the whole world, leaving behind only the quiet murmur of the animals and the rustling of the wind through the trees. Emma found herself missing the simplicity of those days before the fire, when things had seemed predictable. One afternoon, as she was walking down to the barn to check on the cows, she noticed something strange in the distance. Movement quick, darting between the trees. Emma stopped in her tracks, squinting into the woods. The movement was too fast to be one of the farm animals, and too quick to be a normal part of the landscape. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the shadowy outline of a deer. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, another animal larger, more muscular, emerged from the trees. Coyote. Pack of them. John. Emma called out, her voice tight with alarm. We've got trouble. John rushed out from the house, wiping his hands on his overalls. He had been working on repairing the broken sections of the barn, but the urgency in Emma's voice immediately set him on edge. He ran toward her, his gaze following her outstretched arm toward the woods. Emma was already moving toward the barn, but her eyes were locked on the approaching predators. The coyotes were circling the farm now, clearly searching for a weak spot to attack. She had seen the signs before, wild animals coming closer to farms when their natural food sources dwindled, especially after a fire had disrupted the balance of the ecosystem. But the coyotes were a new kind of danger. If they managed to get close to the pigs or the smaller animals in the yard, they would cause havoc. Go to the barn, John said, his voice steady despite the worry in his eyes. Make sure the animals are locked up tight. I'll take care of this. Emma nodded, her heart pounding. She didn't hesitate as she turned to head back to the barn, though her mind raced with fear. Wild predators were one thing, but losing the animals to something they couldn't control, that felt like the final blow. Inside the barn, the cows were nervous. Emma hurried to close the doors, making sure they were securely fastened. The pigs were in their pen, and the chickens in their coop. She felt a surge of relief when she saw them all safe, but she knew the danger was far from over. Outside, John was readying a few old tools, nothing too advanced, but enough to hopefully scare off the coyotes. He had always been good at working with what he had. As he moved toward the edge of the property, he felt a coldness settle in his stomach. The fire had already caused so much damage. Could they afford to lose more? Could they withstand another threat? The coyotes weren't going to be scared off easily. John could see them, 3 of them now, moving toward the edge of the field. They were eyeing the animals, their hunger and desperation palpable. He moved slowly, staying low to the ground, until he was close enough to make a sound. Then, with a loud shout and a quick motion of his arms, he startled them. The coyotes hesitated, their eyes glinting in the fading daylight, before they turned and darted back into the trees. John didn't breathe easy until they were completely gone, and even then, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over him. The coyotes were a new problem, one that they hadn't anticipated. They'd have to do more to keep them away, maybe put up better fencing or set traps. But every solution came with its own set of problems. That night, as they sat down to dinner, the air was thick with unspoken thoughts. John and Emma had always known the farm was a place full of uncertainties, but now it felt like one challenge after another. The fire, the coyotes, the feed shortages, they were all piling up. And yet, they still had to keep going. They didn't have a choice. Emma reached over and took John's hand, her thumb tracing the lines of his rough palm. "What now?" she asked softly. "How do we keep going?" John looked at her, his tired eyes filled with the weight of it all. "One day at a time," he said. "We've always made it through before. We'll make it through again." But as he spoke, a seed of doubt began to grow in his heart. The world had changed, and no matter how much he wanted to believe everything would be fine, there was a nagging voice that wondered, how much more could they endure before it all fell apart? And so, as the fire's scars began to heal, new threats emerged. The farm wasn't the same anymore, and neither were they. But for now, they carried on, finding comfort in each other's presence, in the hope that they could still rebuild. Chapter 7, Lost and Found. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden light over the farm as the day slowly wound to a close. Emma stood in the yard, wiping her hands on her apron after finishing the last of the evening chores. The familiar sights of her animals, pigs rooting through the dirt, cows grazing peacefully in the pasture, should have been comforting, but there was a sense of unease hanging in the air. "John," Emma called out, her voice laced with concern. "Have you seen the geese?" John, who had been mending a section of the barn fence, looked up. He squinted at the small flock of geese that usually wandered the yard, but one was missing. "That's strange," he said, frowning. "I haven't seen it all afternoon." Emma's heart sank. The geese were part of the rhythm of their days, always moving together, honking in the early mornings, waddling about in their usual mischief. She counted them again, her breath catching in her throat as she realized that one was indeed gone. The thought of losing an animal, especially one as seemingly small as a goose, felt like a personal loss, a break in the delicate balance of life on the farm. "We need to find it," Emma said, her voice tight with worry. "It's not like her to wander off." John nodded, his expression hardening. "I'll check the barn and the coop. You take the fields. We'll find her." Emma hurried toward the field, her boots crunching over the dry earth. The evening air was cool, a slight breeze rustling the leaves in the trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, in a way that made her feel more unsettled. She had learned long ago that the farm had its own rhythm, a rhythm that could be easily disrupted by the smallest change. And right now, something about the absence of the gander was making her feel like the ground beneath her was shifting. She walked through the familiar path by the edge of the cornfield, calling out softly, "Come on, girl. Where are you?" The fields were quiet. The fire had left its mark on the landscape, but they had tried to move forward. The earth, still scorched in places, seemed to groan beneath her feet. Emma paused, scanning the horizon for any sign of the missing goose. She turned back, retracing her steps, but still, there was nothing. It was as if the land had swallowed her up. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Emma's mind raced with possibilities. Had the goose been taken by a predator? Had she wandered off too far and gotten lost? The worry gnawed at her insides, and a sense of dread settled over her. The bond she shared with each animal on the farm ran deep. They weren't just livestock, they were family. Losing one of them, even in such a small way, felt like a failure. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, Emma saw a flash of white near the edge of the woods, beyond the old oak tree. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Could it be? She hurried toward the spot, her pace quickening. As she drew closer, she saw the unmistakable silhouette of the goose, standing at the base of the tree, its head cocked to one side as though it were waiting for her. "Thank goodness," Emma whispered, her chest tightening with relief. She reached the bird, kneeling down beside her, gently running a hand over its feathers. The goose seemed unbothered, even a little playful, as it stretched its wings. "You gave me a scare, you silly thing," Emma muttered, a smile tugging at her lips. "What on earth were you thinking?" The goose honked in response, as if to say, "I'm fine, stop worrying." Emma's relief was palpable, but as she picked up the bird and made her way back toward the farm, her mind was full of new thoughts. As she passed through the now empty cornfield, she noticed something that had escaped her earlier, the unmistakable tracks of a wild animal. The coyotes, perhaps, had been prowling closer, waiting for an opportunity. Had the goose wandered into the woods to avoid them, or had she simply gotten lost in the unfamiliar territory? Either way, Emma couldn't ignore the realization that the safety of the farm was more fragile than she had ever imagined. She had thought the animals would always be safe under her care, but now she saw the cracks in that belief, the ways in which they were all vulnerable, dependent on forces outside of their control. When she returned to the yard, John was waiting by the gate, his expression a mix of concern and relief. The sight of Emma, holding the goose gently in her arms, made him smile. "You found her," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "Where was she?" "Just past the trees," Emma replied, brushing the dust from her pants. "She was fine, just lost, I think. But I saw coyote tracks near the woods. We need to be more careful." John's face hardened, and his eyes narrowed. "I'll take care of it. We can't afford to let our guard down now." As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, the farm once again felt quiet, but now there was a sense of unease in the air. The fire had already taken so much from them, and now the wildlife seemed to be closing in, testing their resolve. But Emma wasn't ready to let go of the things she had fought so hard to protect. As she tucked the goose back in with the rest of the flock, she lingered a moment, watching them settle in for the night. They were safe for now, and though the world around them seemed to grow more uncertain by the day, Emma knew that she would continue to do whatever it took to protect the farm, to protect the life they had built. "Tomorrow," she said quietly to herself, "we rebuild." With the last light of the day fading, Emma walked back to the house, feeling the weight of her worries lift just a little. For now, at least the farm was whole again, and sometimes that was all they could ask for. But as she entered the house, her heart still heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead, she couldn't shake the feeling that the next challenge was already on the horizon, waiting to be discovered. Chapter 8. A new perspective on the farm. The weeks following the goose incident were filled with a sense of quiet introspection for both Emma and John. Life on the farm had changed, not just because of the fire or the coyotes, but because the couple had started to see their surroundings in a new light. After all that had happened, they had begun to reevaluate how they managed their land, their animals, and, more importantly, their way of life. The old methods they had always relied on, passed down through generations, no longer seemed enough. The world was different now, and they were beginning to realize that the ways they had done things for years, though tried and tested, were no longer as secure as they once had been. Emma had been the first to notice the shifts in their routine. The animals, though they had been a comfort, were also a growing responsibility. And with each passing day, it seemed the farm was throwing up new challenges. One crisp autumn morning, John stood at the edge of the farm with a weathered look on his face, his hands resting on his hips. Emma walked over to him, her steps slow but purposeful. The morning sun painted everything in soft hues of gold and orange, but there was a heaviness in the air as well. "Do you ever think we've been too stuck in our ways?" Emma asked, her voice breaking the silence. John looked at her with a slight frown, but then his expression softened. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe we need to adapt more, do things differently. The fire, the coyotes, the goose. They've shown me that we can't just rely on old habits. We've been lucky, but luck doesn't last forever." John considered this for a long moment. He had always prided himself on being resourceful, on relying on hard work and persistence. But Emma had a point. He had seen the way the landscape was changing, how the seasons were shifting faster than he could keep up with. There had to be a way to make the farm stronger, more resilient, to weather whatever came next. After a long pause, he finally nodded. You're right. Maybe it's time we teach the younger generation how to do things differently. Maybe they'll know something we don't. And with that, a new sense of purpose emerged in both of them. They began to think about the future in a new way, not just for themselves, but for their children and grandchildren. Emma called up their daughter, Lily, who lived in a nearby town, and invited her and her 2 children to visit the farm. She had always hoped to pass on her knowledge of farming, but now it seemed more urgent than ever. John spent the morning preparing the barn and feeding the animals, while Emma set out to make the farm feel welcoming, hopeful. The idea of sharing their life's work with the next generation brought her a sense of peace. Lily and her family arrived just as the afternoon sun started to dip lower in the sky. The children, a boy named Henry and a girl named Clara, dashed out of the car as soon as it stopped, running across the yard to the pigs, laughing as they clucked like chickens. John and Emma watched them, exchanging glances full of love and concern. All right, kids, John called out with a grin. You're about to get a lesson in farm life like no other. Lily stood beside Emma, watching her children's excitement with a smile. They're eager to learn, she said softly. But are we sure they're ready for all this? Emma chuckled, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. They'll be fine. It's time they learned what it takes to keep a farm running. You and Dan won't always be around, and they'll need to know how to care for the land. Not just the animals, but the soil, the plants, everything. The next few hours were spent teaching the children how to feed the chickens, how to gather eggs, and how to make sure the cows were brushed and comfortable in their stalls. There was a lot of laughter and a fair amount of mistakes, but by the end of the day, Emma and John both noticed something. The children were learning. They were gaining a sense of responsibility, and more than that, they were bonding with the animals. The farm was no longer just a place where things grew. It was a place of connection, a lesson in patience, hard work, and care. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the land, the family gathered around the table for a simple, hearty dinner. They shared stories and laughed, and Emma couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Even in the face of the difficulties the farm had faced, there was something powerful in seeing her children and grandchildren carrying on the legacy of the land. Later that evening, after the guests had left, Emma and John walked the farm together in silence. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a soft light over everything. The fields, though scorched by the fire, were slowly starting to heal. The barn, though damaged, had been repaired. The cows grazed peacefully in the field, and the ducks waddled by the pond. As they passed the barn, Emma looked up at the makeshift repairs they had made. The door still creaked a little, and the roof was patched together with more care than finesse, but it was solid. It was their work, their hands that had fixed it. John followed her gaze and said, "We've done a lot to get back on track, but there's still more to do." Emma nodded, her heart full. "And we'll keep doing it, one day at a time." The next morning, as Emma went about her usual morning chores, she noticed something unusual in the distance. A man was standing by the fence, watching her. He was tall, with rough hands and a weathered face. His clothes were simple but sturdy, and there was something familiar about him. He seemed to be waiting for her to notice. "Can I help you?" Emma called out, walking toward him. The man nodded. "I've been passing through," he said, his voice gravelly. "I heard about the fire, and I wanted to offer some help. You might need it." Emma studied him for a moment before nodding. "We've been getting by," she said cautiously. "But help is always appreciated." The stranger smiled. "I've got some equipment, some tools, and a bit of knowledge about farm repairs. I'm not looking for much, just trying to do my part for the community." Emma hesitated for a moment, then nodded again. "All right, come on in." For the next few days, the man, who introduced himself as Luke, worked alongside John to reinforce the barn structure and make the fence stronger. He showed them ways to patch up the old parts of the farm without spending too much money. It was a relief to have someone who not only knew what they were doing but also genuinely cared about the farm's well-being. Luke's quiet generosity didn't go unnoticed. As the days passed, Emma and John began to feel more hopeful, more sure of the future. It was as if the pieces of their life were slowly starting to come together again. They didn't know how long Luke would stay, But for now, he was just what they needed. A reminder that sometimes help comes from unexpected places. By the end of the week, the farm was beginning to feel more secure. The barn was sturdier, the animals well-fed and well-cared for, and the family was coming together with a new sense of purpose. Emma stood outside the barn, watching the sun sink below the horizon. She had always loved this time of day, the quiet before night fell, the feeling of the earth beneath her feet. The world wasn't perfect, but with John by her side, their children and grandchildren learning the value of hard work, and the kindness of strangers coming when they needed it most, she felt a deep, comforting sense of peace. Perhaps, she thought, the farm was more than just a place to grow food. It was a place where life could begin anew, every day. Chapter 9. Family Harmony. After all the struggles with the bull, Emma and John felt it was finally time to make a decision. The constant tension caused by the animal's unpredictable behavior had worn them down, and they knew it couldn't continue. The bull had failed to live up to its intended role on the farm, and the danger it posed to the barn and the other animals couldn't be ignored. Yet, as John stood by the fence, watching the bull graze peacefully in the field, something shifted in him. He realized that the animal had come to represent something far bigger than just a source of frustration. "We tried," John said quietly, his gaze fixed on the bull. "But I think it's time to let him go. We can't keep living like this. It's not good for him, and it's not good for us." Emma stood next to him, nodding. She had already come to the same conclusion, but hearing John's voice, it made her feel more certain. "It's time. The bull has been a symbol of everything we've been holding on to, even when it wasn't working. Maybe letting him go will help us see that we're ready to move forward." That evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows over the farm, they opened the gate and watched the bull step out into the open pasture. The animal paused for a moment, sensing the freedom before him, and then, with a burst of energy, he ran across the field, his massive form a silhouette against the setting sun. Emma and John stood there, watching him disappear into the distance, and for the first time in a long while, they felt a sense of peace. The decision to release the bull had marked the beginning of something else, something bigger than just the animal's fate. It was the start of a new chapter in their lives, a chapter that involved letting go of old ways and embracing the unknown. The release of the bull became a symbol of change, of new beginnings. But change, as they soon learned, was never simple. News of the bull's release spread quickly through the small town, and with it came the expected opinions. The neighbors were divided on the matter. Some thought Emma and John had acted too hastily, that they hadn't given the bull enough time or attention. Others whispered about the farm's future, wondering what other decisions the couple might make in the years to come. The tension among the locals was palpable, and Emma could feel it when she ran errands in town or bumped into people on the street. One afternoon, while Emma was in the garden, pulling weeds, she heard the sound of boots crunching on gravel. Looking up, she saw a familiar face. Charlie, one of their neighbors. He had a stern look on his face, his hands tucked in the pockets of his jacket as he approached. "I heard you let that bull go," Charlie said, not bothering with a greeting. Emma wiped her hands on her apron and stood up straight. "We did. It wasn't working, and we didn't want to keep him locked up when he wasn't happy." Charlie's brow furrowed. "You didn't think it through, did you? That bull could have brought in a lot of good money for the farm. You've got to think about the future, Emma. You're not getting any younger." Emma held her ground, but she could feel the weight of his words. "I've thought about it plenty," she said calmly. "I believe it was the right decision for the farm. We don't want to keep something that's only bringing us trouble. We have other ways to keep the farm going." Charlie didn't look convinced, and the air between them grew tense. "Well, I hope you know what you're doing," he muttered before turning and walking back down the path. Emma watched him go, her heart heavy. She knew the farm wasn't just a piece of land. It was part of the community. When people started questioning your decisions, it could feel isolating. But she wasn't about to let one person's opinion sway her. John had stood by her, and they had made the right choice together. That was all that mattered. The following days were filled with more conversations, some with neighbors who were genuinely concerned, and others who seemed more interested in criticizing. But Emma and John didn't back down. They knew that, ultimately, their farm and their life together were their responsibility. They didn't owe anyone an explanation, though they understood that others wanted to see them succeed. It was difficult, but they began to feel a growing sense of resolve. One evening, as the sun set and they sat on their porch, Emma and John reflected on everything they'd been through. The farm had been through so much, and yet here they were, still standing. Their strength wasn't just in their ability to work hard. It was in their ability to weather the storms together. "Sometimes I think we've been through more than most people could handle," Emma said softly, leaning against John. "But we're still here." John nodded, wrapping an arm around her. "We're stronger than we think, Em. Stronger than we've ever realized. The farm's seen hard times, but it's also seen us through them. And we're going to keep going." And just like that, the weight of the world seemed a little lighter. There were still challenges ahead, no doubt. But in that moment, Emma and John knew that together, they could face whatever came next. The bull's release had marked a new beginning, not just for the farm, but for them as a couple. They had let go of something that was no longer serving them, and in doing so, they had made space for something better. As the days passed and the farm slowly began to find its rhythm again, Emma and John realized that they had learned something valuable. They had let go of their fear, their attachment to the past, and in doing so, they had discovered a strength they never knew they had. They were more than capable of adapting to whatever the future held, and together, they would continue to nurture their farm and their family, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. In the end, it wasn't just about the farm or the animals. It was about them, their love for each other, and the life they had built together. The future was uncertain, but Emma and John were no longer afraid. They had each other, and that was enough. Chapter 10. A Return to Life. The bull and the fire were now part of the past, fading memories that had shaped the lives of Emma and John, but no longer defined them. The farm, though scarred, had slowly started to heal. It wasn't just the physical repairs to the barn or the clearing of the land where the fire had ravaged the crops. It was the emotional rebuilding, the return of peace to their hearts. The challenges had left their mark, but they had also taught them something invaluable: the ability to endure, to adapt, and to find joy even in the most difficult times. The days that followed the release of the bull and the recovery from the fire were quiet. The rhythms of farm life, feeding the animals, tending to the garden, and taking care of each other, resumed, comforting in their simplicity. John and Emma worked side by side, finding small pleasures in the routine. Each evening, as the sun set behind the hills, they would sit on the porch, watching the colors change in the sky, the peacefulness of the farm surrounding them. It was during these moments of stillness that they truly realized how far they had come. The evening air had a chill to it now, a reminder that winter was creeping closer. One evening, as they gathered around a crackling fire in the yard, their children and grandchildren joined them. The warmth of the fire, the laughter of their loved ones, and the familiar comfort of their shared history filled the night with a sense of belonging. They talked about the past, about how the farm had changed over the years, about the lessons they had learned from both their triumphs and their failures. Emma gazed at her family, feeling a quiet contentment settle in her heart. "You know, we've been through a lot," she said, her voice soft. "But it's these moments, sitting here with all of you, that make it all worth it." John smiled, his hand resting gently on hers. "I couldn't agree more. All those hard times, they just made us stronger, and they taught us to appreciate what really matters." Their grandchildren were playing nearby, their laughter light and carefree, and for a moment, Emma and John just watched, taking it all in. It was the kind of happiness that only the simplest moments could bring, the kind of happiness that was built over years of hard work, love, and resilience. But just as they were starting to feel that life had returned to its peaceful rhythm, something unexpected happened. A figure appeared at the edge of the yard one afternoon, a man they didn't recognize. He was older, with a tired but determined look in his eyes, and as he approached, Emma and John exchanged a glance. Who could this be? The man introduced himself as Thomas, a distant relative of John's from a branch of the family they hadn't seen in years. He explained that he had heard about their struggles, the fire, the trouble with the bull, and had come to visit to offer his help if needed. At first, Emma and John were taken aback. They hadn't expected a visit from anyone, let alone a family member they hadn't heard from in so long. "Well, I have to say, I didn't expect a visit from you," John said, his voice tinged with surprise. "But I'm glad to see you." Thomas smiled, his eyes softening. "I heard about everything you've been through. I wanted to make sure you're all right. I know this farm means a lot to you both." As the afternoon went on, Thomas shared stories of their shared ancestors, of the family history that had been passed down through generations. It was clear that Emma and John were both moved by his words, by the connection they now felt to someone who, despite being a stranger, seemed to understand their struggles in a way others couldn't. "I've got some skills with woodwork and a few other things," Thomas said as they talked. "If you need help fixing up the barn or anything, just let me know. I'm not one for sitting idly by when there's work to be done." The offer was unexpected, but Emma and John both recognized the value of family support. They had always been self-reliant, but in that moment, they understood that accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a reminder that no one had to face life's challenges alone. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with brilliant shades of orange and pink, John and Emma sat back in their chairs, feeling a sense of deep peace settle over them. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air was still, the only sound the occasional crackle of the fading flames. "It's funny, isn't it?" John said, his voice thoughtful. "How life can take you through all these ups and downs. But in the end, it all leads you back here, back to what really matters." Emma smiled, leaning against him. "Yes, it does. And I think we've come to realize that no matter what happens, we'll always have each other. And this farm, this place is our home. And it's enough." For the first time in a long while, Emma and John felt a deep sense of harmony. The farm, their family, and the lessons they had learned over the years had all come together in a way that made everything feel right. They had faced the storms, the fires, and the uncertainties of life. But through it all, they had found something stronger. Each other, their love, and a life built on resilience and connection. And as the night drew to a close, they knew that whatever came next, they were ready for it. Together, they had weathered the hardest of times. And now, with their family by their side and their farm standing strong, they were finally ready to embrace the future. The road ahead might still have its challenges, but Emma and John had learned the most important lesson of all. Life wasn't about avoiding the difficulties. It was about how you faced them and the love and strength you drew from those around you.